Did you know that one of the things that may cause a great impact in the performance of your PHP applications is the way that you define and access your PHP configuration values, and that may cause a great impact in the performance of every PHP request handled by your application? Well, I'm Manuel Lemos. I am a PHP developer for almost 20 years, and for the last 17 years I've been running the PHP classes site. During this time, I've been learning lots of PHP performance optimization tricks and tips that I'm going to share with you, starting here with another talk on the fastest PHP configuration file format. Okay, I'm going to start this talk that has as title the fastest PHP configuration file format, and it is split into parts, and on this first part I will first talk about common PHP formats, and that will give an idea how things work so you can evaluate what could be the fastest format. So let's move on with this talk, and first let me comment with you why configuration file formats matters. One thing is that applications should not hard code parameter values in them, because that makes them hard to maintain. If you use the same configuration values around your application, every time you would change those values, you would have to change different files. So it's better to concentrate the configuration values in a single file or in a single group of files, so it becomes easier to maintain your application. One thing that is also important to retain is that your application may be running on different environments, like for instance your development environment, the testing environment, the production environment, and so on. You may have other environments if it makes sense for you. So it is great that you adopt this practice, which is very simple, and you probably are already adopting, which is separating the configuration of your application from your actual application code. One thing that you also need to remember is that every time you run a PHP script for handling, for instance, a web request, you need to load your configuration somehow on every request. So that may cause a great impact on the performance of your application. So the format that takes more time to load will impact your performance, and that's why it's really important to figure what would be the best, or at least one of the best file formats that you can use for configuration. So let me just list a few of the most important file formats that I'm going to cover in this talk, starting from the ENI file format, XML, YAML, JSON, the PHP serialized format, also the GNU getText format. It is not exactly a general format, but I'll be talking also about it. Using environment variables, and using actual PHP scripts. So let's take a look how which one of these formats can be handled in PHP, starting with INI. The INI format is very popular on Windows applications since many years ago, so many people are familiar with it. Basically, it is a format that allows you to split the configuration of your applications in different sections according to the context of the different configuration values that you may have. In PHP, you can use the parse ENI file function to read the ENI file configuration that you may have. You can also use the parse ENI string if you have the configuration already loaded in a text string. Basically, these parse functions, they actually retrieve the configuration and build an associative array with the different values of the configuration sections and variable values. In PHP, these parse functions also support loading values into nested arrays using the square brackets. So let's take a look at one example so you can understand this better. As you may see here, you have a sample ENI configuration file, and you have different sections that are delimited with these values within square brackets. You may also have comments if you need them. And below here you can see some values that in PHP supports with the square brackets that I'm going to show how they are passed into an associative array here in this example. Well, over here I hope you can see this because the font is a bit small, but if you are watching this video in a good resolution, you can see here this is a dump of the array that is returned by these parse functions for ENI format. You can see the name of the sections, and inside them you see an array of different configuration values. Below here you can see that PHP can also return associative arrays or regular arrays if the original name of the variables is within brackets, as you may see here. If it is an empty bracket, it just uses a numeric index, as you may see here. And if it is there is a name inside of the brackets, it uses an associative array that is returned with the values of each entry with the same name. Now let's move on to the XML format. This format used to be more popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. And in PHP there are several extensions that were added to make parsing and even generation of XML simpler. One of the simplest extensions is called precisely Simple XML. Once you have read a configuration in XML format using the Simple XML extension, you could use this as XML function to save back to XML files if you want to actually change the XML, the configuration or the values, and save them back to files. Let's take a look at an example. As you may know, XML is based on markup. These tags are markup tags, and they can also be nested. You can find tags inside other tags. So let's take a look at the result of parsing these XML configuration values. As you may see here, it returns a simple XML element object that has values inside variables, and also below you can see here that nested elements also return other simple XML element objects to return the values of entries that are inside other tags. Now let's move on to a format that is not so well known among PHP developers, but it has been used by many libraries, many frameworks, so many of you may be familiar with it. YAML means it ain't yet another markup language. It's somehow an improvement over XML because it is more readable. It uses indenting instead of markup tags, so you can identify what values are contained in other values. Despite it is not recent, it was made more popular when the Ruby on Rails framework started adopting it. In PHP, it does not come with built-in support, at least in the core distribution, but there is an extension called Packle YML that can be used to parse YML file formats. As I mentioned, several PHP frameworks support this format with their own PHP code. So let's take a look at an example. As you may see here, there are several entries with a colon and the value in front. Nested values are indented, so you can see that they are contained inside others. So let's take a look at the dump of a variable that contains the result of parsing this YML example. So as you may see, there are the scalar values and the nested values that are contained in other entries also appear as arrays inside arrays. So let's move on and this time talk about the JSON format. JSON format, which actually stands for JavaScript Object Notation, it is basically a form of serializing JavaScript variable values. So if you have a variable value, you can convert it into a string that represents that value, and uses the JSON format to represent that value. It is basically a typed format, which means that implicitly the definition of the format specifies what is the type of each value. It has been made popular with the rise of JavaScript being used everywhere, not just on browser side, but also on server side and even on mobile applications. So JavaScript is pretty popular these days. In PHP, you can use the JSON decode function to parse it and return the values of the definition of configuration values in an object or an array. You can also use the JSON encode function to generate JSON notation from a variable value. So let's take a look at an example. As you may see here, this is the representation of an object with several entries. Some of them are nested. You have an entry with another object inside of it. So when you use the JSON decode function, it will return an array or an object. There's a possibility to convert objects into arrays. So this would be an object, but it was converted into an array with several entries, including one here that contains another array that represents an object that is defined inside it. So now let's move on to a format that is not exactly for general configuration, but is rather for defining the application text translations, which is the GNU getText format. Using this format, you can store text of an application, which personally I also consider configuration, because when you are creating an application that is supposed to run with users of different countries that use different languages, you need to switch the text strings, so it is also a very specific type of configuration. Basically, you can get individual strings for different application contexts, so you can group the definitions of application text in separate files and make it easier to maintain. And those files have the extension PO, and they define application text in a human-readable format. The .mo file extensions are basically binary files that contain compiled translations of the text of your application. So, in the case that you have an application that uses some text, and that text is in the default language, for instance, English, you don't need additional PO or MO files to define the translations for that. And I'll show you why that is not necessary. In PHP, you can use the getText function or the underscore function to get the translation strings for the current language. Let's see an example. Over here, it's a PO file. And as you may see, it has some comments and as the original text in the default language, and as the translation to a specific language. In this case, it is PT, which is Portuguese from Portugal, and you may see different entries for different strings. So when you use some code in PHP to extract these translations and use in your application, it will look more or less like this. First, you have to define some environment variables to specify which language you are using. Then you can define a domain of your application, in this case my PHP app, which will tell the getText extension from which directory it should load these MO files. In this case, you specify that you want text for this context, my PHP app, and it will use the getText function to retrieve the translation for the current language for this string, or the underscore function. If your current language is the default language, for instance English, it will simply return the string that is passed back to it. So that's why there is no need for specifying a file with translations for the default language. Another format that is not exactly used for storing configuration values, but rather to store variables in a way that PHP can read back from a string, is the PHP serialized format. So we can use this format to save any variable value in PHP. It supports typed values. This means that not only the values are stored in this format, but also the types of the values. But unfortunately, it is not very readable by humans, unlike, for instance, the JSON format. So this is probably, I would say, not a very good format for storing configuration values. You would parse the serialized format with the PHP unserialized function, and if you want to save back values to a file in this format, use the serialized function. So let's take a look at how a serialized value would look like. As you may see here, you can see a few letters and numbers that have a meaning, and that meaning depends on the types of values that are being stored. So this is a serialized variable value that, as you may see, it's not very readable for humans, but once you parse it with unserialized, you will get an array, an associative array with several values. They could be of any type supported by PHP, including some nested arrays, as you may see here. One other form of setting configuration values in your PHP applications is to use the so-called environment variables. These in reality are not files, so I'm not talking about a specific file format, but rather values that are set before a web server request is started. You can change the values of configuration set through environment variables using files like .htaccess. One important constraint, I would say, of this solution is that it actually only stores string variables, string values that are associated with each environment variable. So if you want to store other types of values that cannot be represented as strings, like for instance arrays, you probably would need to serialize those arrays in some other format so you can store them as strings for those configuration values. And then in your PHP application you would have to unserialize them, and that probably would take some time on each request. Maybe not much time, but some time. In PHP you can use the getEnv function, or either the underscore server or underscore env superglobal variables to retrieve the configuration values from the environment variables. Finally, I'm going to talk a bit about what would be the PHP format. Basically, the PHP format are just simple PHP scripts that define variables that have values of your configuration that you want to use in your application. So since it is PHP code, it is readable by all the PHP developers, because PHP developers are well aware of how PHP code looks like. Since it is all in PHP, it requires no additional processing when you are loading the configuration. Basically, you load those configuration values from PHP scripts using include or require commands. Usually for configuration, there can be two ways that are more common to define configuration values for your application, which can be either arrays or classes. Let me show you an example of defining PHP configuration with arrays. Over here, as you may see, it's a PHP script. It just defines one variable to which you assign the definition of one array. Since this is PHP, you can define any type here, including other nested arrays. Now let's take a look at one less common solution that we may probably not be aware, but it can also be used with a certain advantage, which is using classes to define your configuration. So rather than having an array, you would have a class. You can call it anything. In this case, I called it configuration, just to make it simple, but you can use even namespaces if you prefer, to avoid class name collision. And that configuration class has some public variables that you can access when you have created a configuration object of this class. And these classes variables already have some default values. Usually, I recommend that you put some default values here that are the ones that you would use in production. And as you may see here, that is the database source name value. In this case, it identifies that you probably want to access a MySQL database with this host name and this database name. And over here you see database user and database password. You see that these values are empty. This is for security reasons. If these values are going to be used in production, you should not commit this to your version control repository with the production username and passwords, because that could disclose information about that is sensitive to people that should not be aware of it. So how would you use this class? You just create an object of this class, and it would be and you just use access the variables with these names here to retrieve its configuration values. But this is the simplest example. So in this first part of this talk, I have described a few of the most common file formats that are being used for storing configuration values of your PHP applications. In the second part, I will be talking more about the actual aspects that you should consider when you evaluate what could be the fastest file format that you can use, not only considering aspects about speed, but also flexibility and maintainability of your code. By the time that you are watching this video, the second part may not yet be ready because it is being edited. So if you want to see the second part, you may sign up below this video. There is a button for you to sign up using your Facebook account or your email address. And when the second part is available, you receive a notification so you can come and watch the second part. So see you on the second part of this talk.